Well, let me start by saying that I was born in Detroit, Michigan, and that at the time I was born in 1938, from 38 to 58, the Greek community in Detroit was the fourth largest in the United States. And I think that what was going on in Detroit was more typical of other cities than what was going on in Chicago and New York, because those were unique cities with their own particular personalities. But Detroit was more like towns like Lowell, Pittsburgh, Youngstown, the mining towns, and what have you. And in Detroit, everything was about takara, the cars. That's why the Greeks went there. They started arriving about 1905, 1910, and came in bigger numbers in the teens. Before I talk about my father, I'd like to talk about the Assumption Church, which was a community I grew up with. And I think the location of the church tells you much about this parish. A mile north was Briggs Manufacturing. Half a mile north was Mack Stamping, which is a Chrysler plant. A mile south was Hudson Motors. Half a mile east was Bud Wheel and a bunch of tool and die shops. In about 5 minutes car ride was Dodge Main and U.S. Royal. Everybody in the parish either worked in the automobile industry or provided a service direct to the automobile industry. My father was born in Sidrokastron, which is a Chorio outside of Kiparissia in the western Peloponnesus. And he and a man named Demetrius Manos gathered their money in the late teens. They walked to Patra and they took a boat to America. Ninth grade education, the grade school education, there's no high school. And didn't speak English. Arrived in New York and got a whole lot of terrible jobs. The worst one was cleaning out the insides of furnaces, and look when they came covered with soot and so forth. And then he said, let's go to Detroit because they're hiring in the automobile industry. And we call all the Greek men called Theo usually. So Theomanos and my father arrived in Detroit. They went to work for Chrysler, and Theomanos would remain an automobile worker for the rest of his life. He married a Polish woman, and they had 3 children, none of whom are Greek identified. My father could not stand the noise in the dirt of the factory, so he went and worked in a lunch counter. And lunch counter in those days was just that. It was a Formica counter, and donuts, coffee, real short item stuff. It wasn't a diner, and it wasn't a luncheonette. And he worked his way through various jobs, became a bartender, and then finally, just before World War II, he and 3 other Peloponnesian guys opened up a bar outside of Hudson Motors. That's where they finally made some money in the United States. And when you go through the history of all the other people in the parish, it's very similar. Most of them either went and worked in the factories, or they had, like Cumbado Queros, had a luncheonette across the street from Briggs Manufacturing. And he and his wife ran the luncheonette, and they lived upstairs in the apartment, and they waxed and waned according to the car industry. When Briggs was doing well, they did well. When Briggs was doing poorly, they did poorly. The one Greek insurance guy we knew had his office outside of the automobile factories on the same street. One Greek sold the morning free press at the factory gates. So the foods business was always connected to the industry, and many people actually worked in the industry. And one of the things that was very clear is they didn't mind working in the industry, but they didn't want you to end up that way. Every single person would say, my kids should not have to work in the factories. You got to go to school. We're doing this not for you because this is better than what we had before. This is all we can do. But you can do better and you will do better. And so they really emphasized education, including the women. which was a little different than some of the other ethnic groups where the women were not included. Now, there were two neighborhoods. There was the old neighborhood around the Assumption Church, which everybody lived in before World War II, and they rented apartments. During World War II, if you didn't go in the military and get killed or serve in the military, if you worked in Detroit, you could make a lot of money. The automobile factories were running 24 hours a day, and everything involved with automobiles made a lot of money. And the New Deal had come in, and the New Deal had made unions possible. And in Detroit, we had the United Automobile Workers, which had some very fierce struggles, but by 1940, they had gained control of the automobile industry representation, and they had very good wages, very good benefits for their workers. And I would say this about the Detroit Greeks: they were ardent New Deal Democrats. To be a Republican was a Martian. I mean, they didn't exist. Such a creature didn't exist. Or if they did, they had to be demented. And Franklin Roosevelt's picture was everywhere. If you go to the HEPA, wherever you go, there's a picture of Franklin Roosevelt. After the war, we moved to, almost the entire community moved about 2 or 3 miles further east, out of the factory district, into a neighborhood that I always called the smorgasbord neighborhoods. There were smorgasbord because every ethnic group you can imagine was available in those groups. So that it was not a Greek neighborhood, but I would say at least half, maybe 60% of the people were ethnic. And my block was very, very typical. On the right-hand side of our house was the Belgians, and on the left-hand side of the house were Irish. Across the street, there were the Sicilians, the Polish, the hillbillies, and the Scots. And in that block, there must have been about 15 different ethnic groups. And the odd part was they all got along fairly well. And people sometimes ask me, were you ever ashamed or hesitant about being Greek? I never gave it a second thought. I was just who I was. And it was quite easy. I mean, were there some people that were snotty about the foreign-born or the little Greek boy? Yeah, but it was nothing. It was just, it's not even worth mentioning practically. And the children got along very well. I mean, what I call it the Americans, those had a long pedigree in America, and the ethnic kids got along fine. The only difference was the older we got, the less the ethnic kids understood American society. So it came to something like the school play, or dating, or going steady. Can you imagine a Greek person from the Horio saying their daughter's going steady? What does that mean? You're going to get married soon? So there were some of those tensions, but they were social tensions. Now, I said it was a smorgasbord neighborhood, which included a lot of Hispanics, mainly Mexicans, but these are Mexicans very much like the European immigrants. They'd come from Mexico, they worked in automobile factories, they spoke English, and their kids had the same attitudes as we did. They did not speak Spanglish. They either spoke Spanish or they spoke English, and they wanted their kids to learn English. So that group of Mexicans, which has been written about, there were a lot of them in that neighborhood, and we didn't think of them particularly any different than would of Italian or an Irish or something like that.
The blacks?
No, I was going to say there were Chinese, there were Jews, there were no blacks, and I would not. In school, until I went to high school, I never had black schoolmates. And then later on when I went to college, I got to know a lot of black people and became pretty good friends with them. Now, my mother's story is completely different than my father's story. And basically goes back to my grandfather, Papu. My Papu was a very individualistic thinker. Probably the most individualistic thinker I have in the Greek community. And in Turkey, he had some Turkish friends and so forth. His wife had died. He was wooing a Greek woman, and so was a Turk. They got into a fight. Knives flashed. The Turk was killed. And Papu had to leave the country. Strange enough, his Turkish friends insisted he not stand trial, that he get out of there because they knew what would happen. They helped him, and he was in the area of Smyrna. He went to Smyrna, got in a boat, went to Marseille, was illegal in Marseille, stayed there for a couple of years. The French sort of began making fusses about the foreign-borns. He got in a boat, went to New York, jumped ship. I think he actually swam ashore. And he worked in Coney Island in this strange kind of hotel gambling, who knows what kind of place. The police eventually got around there, and he left, and he entered Canada illegally. And it was in Canada that he met another Greek, and they decided to go to a very small town called Chatham, which is about 50 miles east of Detroit. And they were the only two Greeks in town. They opened a candy shop. They did okay. Being Greeks, they had a fight. So one of them opened a new store on the north side of town, the other one on the south side of town. And my grandfather then would have this kind of general store, which he sold cigarettes and candy, and he had an ice cream counter, and he had produce. But being Papu, he also raised canaries, and he sold canaries to people. And at first, Canada was not what it is today. They were there. These are straight. Greek was an odd character, but he was very charming. And strangely enough, the people who liked him the best were some of the old-time ladies who'd come there with their budgie birds, and he'd take care of their budgie birds there and so forth. So he got to be kind of the town character, and people liked him. My mother he had to leave my mother in the old country when he left. And he left them with relatives, and he sent money back to Greece to take care of them. And then in 1922, when the Turks advanced on Smyrna, it's not clear what happened, but somehow my mother and uncle got separated from their relatives. Whether they were abandoned or whether it happened, I don't know. It's not clear. I don't think she understood. She was 12 years old. He was 10. And they walked to Smyrna. They got themselves to Smyrna somehow. And in Smyrna, they were lucky enough to be grabbed up by some agency, but they were on the docks. And they were on the docks when the city started burning and all the things that we know about the Smyrna disaster. But by sheer luck, they got put on a boat, and they went to visit they went to all the ships in the harbor, and no ship would take them. In that period was when they wouldn't take anybody except one ship, a Japanese ship. And she went aboard, and the Japanese ship took her to Piraeus. Now, it's interesting because there's some recent literature that came out that there was no Japanese ship. It's mythology. Well, I don't know why my mother would tell me mythology when I was 5 years old or 6 years old. It was a real ship. Then she was in an internment camp in Volos for about 2 years, and then finally my grandfather, Papu, found out where she was, brought her to America. She and my uncle were classic, could be like a Charlie Chaplin movie. They had tags on their things because they couldn't speak English. Tags who they were. They got on this boat died in Quebec. My grandfather picked them up in Quebec, and they went to Chatham. In Chatham, they had a hard time with the other kids. A lot of fist fights. My mother cracked one kid's head open with an umbrella. It was. That wasn't such a good time. But there were some really nice Canadians too. And my grandfather had very good Canadian friends, particularly two sisters, Ruby and Bee, and they remained lifelong friends. And that's one thing I want to say. The Detroit Greeks, almost all of them had American friends. They had Greek friends, but they also had American friends. And my Papu in particular, he seemed to have more non-Greek friends than he had Greek friends. My father started looking for a wife around 34, 35, and with the help of another Greek in the parish, somehow, this mystical way Greeks have, they found about this girl in Chatham, and there was an arranged marriage, and they got married in 1936. My mother came to America and became an American citizen. And my grandfather would come to America in the late 40s after he closed his store. Now, my family, Peloponnesian on the one side and Smyrna on the other side, in some ways was representative of the Assumption congregation. Most of them were Peloponnesians, mostly from the eastern Peloponnesus, and a lot of people from Asia Minor. Now, the Asia Minor was a smaller group, but there were quite a few. Those were the two. There hardly anybody from the islands, nobody from the Pontus. I don't remember anybody from Macedonia, and they got along fine. Usually, in Greece there was tension when the Asian Minor people came. There was no tension in that community. All the Anatolians were for Venizelos, and most of the Peloponnesians were royalists, but they were not crazy royalists. In other words, they were New Dealers in America. So their idea of the royal family was, it's the flag. It's something to do with Greek independence. It has to do with the Peloponnesians led the war for independence. So it was that kind of royalism, because they weren't really conservative. They weren't really socially conservative at all. And there's the other thing I want to say, that so much of the literature about these people has them as kind of almost brutish. They were illiterate for the most part. Well, I shouldn't say they were illiterate, because a lot of them did read Greek and so forth. But they learned English in America, and they learned English quite well. I think because they worked between working in the factory or working in a diner. You meet Americans all the time. After 5 or 10 years, your English gets pretty good, and their English was good. I wouldn't say it was perfect English, but it wasn't Gringlish. Anybody could understand what they were saying, and this is true of Detroit. I don't know if it's true elsewhere. They really had contempt for people who didn't speak English. There was one Greek woman who never learned English, and I really said, ugh, yeah, they just kind of were contemptuous of her as living in some strange place. She only lived 2 blocks away, but she never went out of the house. She couldn't do anything. They thought she was completely isolated. And my grandfather was particularly hot on this issue. He says, "Oh, they came to America. What? They come to America to speak Greek? They came to America to speak Italian?" So they were firm. And it was a practical matter, because they weren't ashamed of their Greekness, but they said, you got to learn English. And they were quite sophisticated in many different ways. Gumbarocaris became a shop steward for the UAW, and came election time, he'd call us up and give us the preferred candidates. Papu, who's always a smart guy, liked the people next door because they're related to the local congressman. And he said, "Oh, it's very good to know your congressman," and he'd go there all the time, make sure he had access to the congressman just in case you needed some political assistance. Mr. Ziguris, who was a bookie, we should talk about that a little bit. He had a big cigar, and he had a wart, and he always wore a white shirt and tie, and so he looked like a typical kind of off the boat guy. But he ran the numbers in horses, and after he died, 3 Wayne State University professors showed up at the funeral with flowers, and Katina Ziguris, his wife, said, "Who are you?" And it turned out that Mr. Ziguris knew Russian, and he would go and hang out with the professors at least once a month, and they knew him and liked him. This guy with the cigar and the wart, And one time I was talking to him, and I said, what's wrong with Detroit? He said, what makes a great city? He said, can't have a great city without parks and fountains. Well, it's kind of interesting, And I could go through and tell some other stories about different people. Now, gambling. Let's talk about gambling. In Detroit, we had Greektown. Greektown came into existence about 1910. And what happened when the Greeks arrived in Detroit is they were not wanted. They were considered near white, so, sort of grudgingly white. And so they were pushed to live in a area in downtown Detroit, which is adjacent to Paradise Valley. Paradise Valley is where the blacks lived. And it's paradise, not because it's heaven, but because of drugs. And so the Greeks were kind of a buffer zone. And probably from about 1920 to about the 50s, Greek town was very Greek. You wanted olive oil, you want feta, you want good bread, you want pastries, you want good olives, you go to Greek town. Because they didn't have that in supermarkets. And so it was a very Greek place. But the Greeks didn't live there. Very early, the Greeks began to move out into the neighborhoods, and the people who were left in Greek town were mainly bachelors and a few sailors who worked in the Great Lakes. But people went there as a shopping, restaurants, and there was kafania. There were fantastic coffee houses. There was also a workers' club before the in the 30s and the 40s. But the kafania were great. They had huge windows, and it was sort of like when you stood on Monroe Street and you looked in the kafania, and inside was Greece and outside was America. And you just walked right through, and then you sat down at the table there, and then you were in Greece. You look out on America, and the guys who were there, you know, they had their Greek coffee, they had their newspapers, and they did a little gambling. The Greeks never had Greek neighborhoods, except for Greek town, which is right when they sort of arrive. Then they immediately branch out and they move into these neighborhoods like I talked about, the smorgasbord neighborhoods. All Greek neighborhoods were unknown in Detroit. Now, usually people within walking distance, you could walk to their houses. And in the new neighborhood, they were a little further. So they were close enough that you could, you know, see each other a lot, but not side by side. It was not a solid Greek neighborhood, and there were not Greek stores or anything like that.
So they kept the tradition, food, music.
They kept their traditions within the household, yeah. Very strongly, very strongly. And what it was, the major organization, I mean, everybody went to church, but they sort of had the Greek attitude toward church. Women went on Sundays and men went on holidays, that kind of stuff. But, you know, yeah, that's where you got married, that's where you got baptized, that's where you got buried, you know, all that kind of stuff. But they weren't really listening. They weren't in control. The church was not in control of them. What they basically had, it was not a HEPA, it was not GAPA, it was the local regional society, the Arcadians, or something like that. And it's there where they would go and meet. And they were the ones that gave the parties. They had a wonderful party every summer, and you'd go there, be lamb turning on a spit, and these musicians would come from Toledo and play clarino, and all Greek foods and so forth. On holidays, it often gathered people's houses and sing in Greek. So they maintained their traditions that way. But it was the ethnic societies more than the church or the political organizations. No. First of all, I know that's shocking to people here. They sort of made noises in that direction, but there's nothing very serious. But let's look at it more closely. The Anatolians had nowhere to go. And, you know, they were, you know, and my grandfather was great. Papu was wonderful. He would say, he'd look at something and say, American, bad, bad. Then he'd look at something and say, Greek, bad. And I say, what the hell? I'm Greek and American. Well, nothing's good. And then he'd say, modern. That was good. Modern things usually were Greek, or usually American. And then he'd say tradition. And tradition was Greek, usually. And that was good. So I developed what I call ethnic third eye. It didn't matter if it was Greek or if it was American. Was it good or bad? And so you took it out of its ethnic context. And I'll say this, he wasn't very patriotic. Well, what he would say about the Turks, the Greek government, I mean, he was, and so the American government, yeah, they're okay, you know, if it's a government, they want to take your money away from you with taxes and things. That's another example. He became a great master of the bonds, and he knew about interest-free bearer bonds. Well, here's this guy from Smyrna in Detroit, somehow learns about finance. At any rate, the Greeks would talk about how wonderful Greece was, and they'd go on and on. Papu would say, "Oh yeah, how come you left?" Now usually, and then he said, "Why don't you go back?" I mean, when somebody would say that, normally you'd say, "Hey, they're racist. They hate you. Go back to where you came from." But he was saying, and he was very clear because he was saying this inside. He was around the table. It wasn't with the Americans. He was saying, "Why did you come to America? Are you happy here or are you unhappy here? So don't burden your children with this Greece that doesn't really exist. Yeah, you remember all the good things, but there were enough bad things to bring you to America." Now, during World War II, Greektown became a little more sexy, a little more in for the Americans because of Ohi. So Greektown began to change a little bit. And then in the 50s and the 60s, Greek became in. We had Colossus from Marusi from Henry Miller, Alexandrian Quartet, Ray Davlin's Cavafy, so the intellectuals. But there were a lot of Hollywood movies. Beneath the 12-Mile Reef was a big one. And Boy and a Dolphin, Sophia Loren playing a gorgeous Greek. It's a horrible movie. And then came Never on Sunday, and then Zorba the Greek. And so tourists began to come to Greektown. And for a while there, Greektown was sort of a nice balance between the Americans coming in and the Greeks. But I say that because in the 1950s, first of all, in the 1940s and earlier, the Greeks could not afford to go back to Greece. I mean, going back to Greece was not so easy. You go on a boat, you have to spend a lot of time, spend a lot of money. Well, these are working class people. They can't take out 2 months to go to Greece. They can't take away a month. But after the 50s, they could. But most of them didn't. But the kids went. And the one Greek woman that did go was Kubara Messina, who was born 4 doors from my father. And we became Kubati in the United States. And she went back to Greece, she went back to the village, and what did she find? She found the same village she left. No electricity, no running water, one telephone at the public place, outhouse with the newspapers, and so forth. You know, time to come home. And home was now Detroit. And so very few of the Greeks went back to Greece. A lot of the relatives had died, and a lot of the men still couldn't afford the time to take off so much time to go to Greece. But we did. We all made the pilgrimage, and we all felt the same way, that we really liked the Greeks and we felt kindly to them, but we realized in my suitcase I had more clothes than my relatives owned of everything put together. So the Greeks in Detroit said, you know, it's a good thing we came to America. And they became super patriotic. And they didn't look down on the Greeks, but they wanted the Greeks to be as American as possible. So anything in American foreign policy that supported Americanization of Greece, they supported because it was good for America and it was good for Greece. So returning to, and I don't know if any of them were retired to Greece. And I remember too, Kubaro Lazos went one time. I met him in the 60s there, and they're visiting their relatives, and their relative was a working construction worker, and they used to argue politics all the time. Because his relative was a lefty, and she was criticizing America, Vietnam, blah, blah, and Kubaro Lazos was kind of defending America. And then he went down to Constitution Square one day, and he bought a newspaper, and he bought a left-wing newspaper. And he's sitting there drinking coffee, reading the Greek newspaper, and a cop comes along and says, "You're not allowed to read this newspaper." He says, "What do you mean?" He says, "This is Constitution Square. You can't read this paper here." And Kubati gets furious. He got angry and so forth. And then when he went back, and he didn't have the fight. He said, I'm beginning to understand why you people, why you feel the way you do, because you have a different system than our own.